Good evening, everyone. I will give people another minute or so to trickle in, and then we will get started with tonight's program. See lots of people attending from all over. We've got LA, Sag Harbor, Albany, New Jersey, Old Salem, Harlem, Troy, Brooklyn. What a great turnout.
That's a nice mix.
Yeah. Oh, Forest Hills.
Anybody from the Caribbean?
Anyone from the Caribbean here? Upper East Side. I'd like to be in the Caribbean right now. With all this snow. Oh, we've got Toronto.
Okay.
In the other direction. Bunch of people from Washington Heights. That's great. Neighbors.
Yeah, nice.
Oh, Jamaican living in the US.
Okay.
Oh, DR in Haiti.
Okay.
Nice.
Nice mix, son.
Yeah. Great. All right. Well, it is 6:02. So I think that we will get started. And as people trickle in, they can join us. So welcome, everyone. This is the first talk of our virtual lecture series talking about race matters. Join the conversation. My name is Meredith Horsford, and I'm the executive director of the Dyckman Farmhouse Museum. We are so delighted to continue this series, which was very successful when we ran it first in August of 2020. This is going to be a 6-week series, obviously beginning during Black History Month, during which we will discuss and tell the stories of New York's Black history. Each week will be a different speaker touching on a unique New York Black experience, of course, followed by some Q&A. Race has been an important topic that influences our lives historically and in the present, which is the reason that we began this series last summer. We feel that it is important to facilitate these conversations with experts, even though they can sometimes be challenging conversations. Each week, we will look at the topic of race from a different perspective, similar to our series last summer when we heard from anthropologists, a historian, and an archaeologist. Our goal for this series has been to encourage everyone to come together, learn from one another, and to continue the conversation. Before we get started, I'd like to familiarize you with Crowdcast, the platform we're using tonight, so that we can make sure any of your questions or comments get answered. So on the right-hand side of your screen, you'll see a chat box where you've all been saying hello to one another and letting us know where you're from. If you need technical assistance, please write it here in the chat box, and Melissa, who is our Development and Community Engagement Manager, will assist you. During the lecture, if you have any questions for the speaker, please click the Ask a Question button towards the bottom center of your screen, and we will either answer those questions during the talk or at the very end. We would like to thank everyone for attending. We've had such great turnout for these virtual programs, which is amazing. We feel very strongly that our program remains free of charge so that it is accessible to all. The response to this lecture series has been overwhelming, and there is clearly a need for us to talk more about the issues that divide us and the issues that unite us as Americans. As a small nonprofit organization, we rely on grants and donations to support these programs. This event has been made possible in part with a sponsorship by TD Bank. This series is also made possible in part by funding from the New York Community Trust, a Humanities New York Cares grant with support from the National Endowment for the Humanities, and the Federal CARES Act. We are grateful for their contributions, which have assisted us in our continued success with this lecture series. If you would like to make a donation to help us to continue our free community programming, it would be greatly appreciated. We will also give you an opportunity to donate at the very end of the program. Gifts in any amount are greatly appreciated. You can also find the donate button at the bottom of your screen at any time during the lecture. So tonight, we are joined by Mr. Herbert Signoret, who is Director of Academic Advising at the Colin Powell School and Associate Director of the Institute for the Exploration of Seneca Village History. The goal of the Institute is to conduct ongoing research on the site of Seneca Village to educate the public about its significance to the city's history and to commemorate the site. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce Mr. Herbert Signoret, presenting Unearthing New York City's Forgotten Past, Seneca Village, the life and death of an African-American and Irish immigrant community.
Well, thank you for a warm welcome, and I'd like to thank participants for braving the cold weather to be in the comfort of your home to take part virtually. So, a special thank you to the Dyckman House Museum for giving me the opportunity to share the story that has been silenced. Institutions like yours are a vital cog in creating a forum to unearth New York City's complex history and navigate the evolution of identities. I fondly remember working at an institution similar to yours when I did my first archaeological field school with Professor Diana Wall, looking for the privy at the old merchant's house in Lower Manhattan. Traditionally, I would have you engage as active learners in this process by having you work with copies of historical documents. This virtual setting does not allow this. However, it opens the talk to folks who otherwise would not have been able to attend. So let's work with the positives. This talk is entitled Seneca Village, Unearthing a Forgotten Community. And it's an exploration of issues of displacement, what we might term maybe something gentrification, and looking at the changing racial landscape of 19th century New York City. I'll attempt to give you the history of the community, but also the process by which historical archaeologists unearth these stories. The work is interdisciplinary, and it's collaborative in its nature. The Institute for the Exploration of Seneca Village stems from a collaborative endeavor with Professor Diana Wall and yours truly from the City College of New York, Cynthia Copeland, then of the New York Historical Society and now with NYU, and Professor Nan Rothschild, who was then at Barnard College, Columbia University, developing an advisory board made up of members of the descendant community, educators, and various specialists, and some you will meet later. The African-American Irish immigrant community of Seneca Village offers a unique lens through which to explore the lives of African-Americans who live in New York City during the city's capitalist and immigrant expansion in the early to mid-19th century. This period of study has traditionally been dominated by analysis of the immigrant experience. As such, the lives of African-Americans and their urban experience has been somewhat silenced. This talk hopes to give a voice to the urban experience of African Americans who lived during this turbulent antebellum period and recognize the contribution they have made to the city's development. Seneca Village's story commences in 1824 when a white couple, John and Elizabeth Whitehead, purchased farmland on Manhattan's Upper West Side. This land was then subdivided. On September 27, 1825, Andrew Williams, a 25-year-old African-American, bought the first 3 lots for $125. That same day, trustees of the African Methodist Zion Church purchased 6 lots near 86th Street for use as a cemetery for colored people. Epiphany Davis, an African-American stockbroker and trustee of the AME Zion Church, also bought 12 lots for $578. These initial purchases laid the foundation for development of Seneca Village. The Institute for the Exploration of Seneca Village History believes that the initial purchases was an attempt to be enfranchised. It so happened during that period, New York State changed the voting laws, and raised requirement for African Americans to vote. In that, to vote, African American males had to own property valued at $250 and be residents of the city for 3 years. During that same period, the requirement for white males was reduced. I trust that many of you are familiar with Central Park, but how many of you use the park and think of what might have existed prior to the park's creation? The village is defined by the boundaries. The southern boundary would be 82nd Street, and the northern boundary would be 89th Street. And the western boundary would be 8th Avenue, what we call Central Park West. And if you continue with 7th Avenue into the park, that would be the eastern boundary. As you know, Seneca Village is an African-American and European, mainly Irish immigrant community, and it existed from a period of 1825 to 1855. However, the city took over the lands through Eminent Domain in 1853 for the creation of Central Park. The community was destroyed and its residents were displaced during an economic downturn. So these are people who would be most severely affected by an economic crisis and being disposed of the land during this very crucial period. Now, to get this done, it came on the heels of a media smear campaign that demonized, and in other words, it ordered the park dwellers and inhabitants of Seneca Village, thus raising questions about the social fabric of the predominantly Black community. Using historical archaeological methods, we study seeks to explore the issues of gentrification and displacement, and explore New York's rapidly changing antebellum landscape and its impact on African Americans, those particularly those living in Seneca Village. I could take a minute and read this article from the New York Herald. It's from August 11, 1871. It goes, yesterday afternoon, while laborers were engaged in uprooting trees at the new entrance to Central Park, corner of 85th Street and 8th Avenue, we discovered 14 inches beneath the surface, a black rosewood coffin, richly mounted and in a state of good preservation. On the lid was a plate with the engraving, Margaret McKinty, died February 1852, aged 16 years, 3 months, and 14 days. Within the coffin was the body of a woman, decayed almost to a skeleton. At a short distance from the spot, another coffin was found, enclosing the body of a Negro, decomposed beyond recognition. This land was dug up 5 years ago when the trees were planted there, and no such coffins were there at the time. Take a minute and just analyze what we just read. Is there anything about this article that seems unusual? Why do you think there might be more detail in Margaret McKinty's description? How do they know that this is the body of a Negro if the body was decomposed? Are these burials part of a cemetery? Just take note of it, you'll be tested later. Now, this is a depiction of the 5 Points area, and it's an area what has been described as center for sex, drugs, and rock and roll in New York City in the early 19th century. And if you to look at this image, what ideas is the artist trying to convey? How you describe the scene? You see it's crowded, it's dense. How African Americans or people of Black pictured in this image? You see the man in the center seems out of place, but his features are refined, whereas the folks around him, the image is a caricature. In that way, you see, it's a process of othering, and it's a sense of using art to dehumanize and other people who in this area are mainly immigrants and African American. What's happening here is we have to look at the city's historical development to understand the transformation that is taking place in 19th century New York City. Notice historical archaeologists Diana Wall, Christopher Matthews, and Alison McGovern state that New York City went through major changes during the antebellum period. This led to the emergence of a center of capitalism in the United States. These changes were included, but were not limited to changing the mode of production with artisanal production, with both apprentices and enslaved labor, to a production with free labor from a growing immigrant population. According to historian and advisory board member Leslie Harris, New York City had the largest free Black population in Northeast as it emerged as a port city. If you look at the figures from this map, you can see the shift in population between 1830 and, let's say, 1855, when Seneca Village was destroyed. Here, you see how the percentage of African Americans decreased dramatically from 1830 being about 7% to about 1.8% in 1835. In absolute numbers, Rosenwald, who this data is from, lists the Irish population in New York City at 17,773, and African Americans at 13,976. This number shifts dramatically by 1855 to the Irish being about 175,735, and African American population being 11,840. Question: what is the impact of European immigration on African Americans living in Seneca Village? And can we look at their expulsion from this community as a subjective form of gentrification? The academic Marshall Berman, who was at CCNY, looks at the 19th century as a distinctive period in modernity. Berman states that this is a landscape of steam engines, automatic factories, railroads, vast industrial zone of teeming cities that have grown overnight, often with dreadful human consequences. New York City was once a city where it grew exponentially overnight with destructive results for the natural environment and the social fabric of the city. What fueled this growth? Part of it is stemming from the Erie Canal. The Erie Canal was a waterway that actually opened up just around the time that Seneca Village started. New York City's grid was developed from the Commission's plan of 1811. This plan developed in response to the city's exponential growth. The plan ignored the natural topography of Manhattan. The grid required significant leveling to make it easier for developers to build straight-sided and right-angle houses according to the Commission's plan. As a result, the natural landscape of Manhattan was altered in significant ways. As the city grew exponentially, the idea that there's a need for a park to move away from the development that was taken downtown took root. But in the move to create the idea of the park, there was a smear campaign that denigrated the people who live in that area that would be created as a park. This is an article from the New York Times, May 28, 1856. And I'll just read the area that is highlighted in yellow. West of the reservoir, within the limits of the Central Park, lies a neat little settlement known as Seneca Village. The Ibon inhabitants after whom the village is called present a pleasing contrast in their habits and the appearance of their dwellings to the Celtic occupants, in common with hogs and goats of the shanties of the lower part of the park. They have been notified to remove by the 1st of August. The policemen find it difficult to persuade them of the idea which has possessed their simple minds, but the sole objective of the authorities in making the park is to procure their expulsion from the houses which they occupy. It is hoped that the removal will be effective with as much gentleness as possible. And it goes on. If some of the hogs and goats and other inmates of the shanties in this vicinity do not die of a yellow fever this summer, it will only be because Death himself hesitates to enter such dirty hovels. As a New Yorker reading an article describing people living in that area, what sort of response do you think people reading that article would have of the people living in that community? How accurate is that description of the people living in that community? Just think of it for a minute. Is there a difference in the way people who are described as Celtic, is there a difference between the way they are described compared to people who are African American? And I'll just read that part for you again. The Ebon inhabitants after whom the village is called present a pleasing contrast in their habits and the appearance of their dwellings to the Celtic occupants, in common with hogs and goats of the shanties in the lower part of the park. By creating an image where people are living together with hogs and goats or animals, it puts them at that level. So in a way, it offers them a process of humanization is taking place in making them other. Your sympathy for somebody who's not human is very different. So the whole process of racialization and humanizing is taking place here. Look, here's another article giving some that contrasting image of a settlement. Here it's from the New York Daily Tribune, August 5th, 1853. And it's laying of a cornerstone for the building of one of the churches that was in Seneca Village. I read, laying of a cornerstone. The cornerstone of the first African Methodist Episcopal Church of Yorkville was laid yesterday afternoon. It is situated in 85th Street between 7th and 8th Avenue. The sermon for the occasion was preached by Reverend Christopher Rush, superintendent of the African churches, who also laid the cornerstone. His text was part of the 6th verse of the first chapter of the first epistle of Peter. The box which was deposited in the cornerstone contained a copy of the Bible, a copy of the hymn book of the African Methodist Episcopal Zion Church in America, a copy of the discipline of the same church, a letter of the name of the 5 trustees of this church, and a copy of the Tribune and of the Sun. The building will be 22 by 40 in size, will be built of wood and painted white. The basement of it will be a schoolroom for the education of colored children. Towards 50 colored families reside in the neighborhood of this church. There are 30 members in this society, and the congregation usually numbers about 100 persons. Here you get a very different image from what was given previously. Here you see they are going to build a church. You get a sense of the dimension of the structure, the idea of creating a time capsule to capture the period. So just in that article, you see there's a lot of information that we're able to get and contrast it with what was given previously. However, this did not prevent the authorities for going ahead and making a decision to create a Central Park in that location. And this possession, the inhabitants and the community of a place they called home and cherished as a community for over 30 years. That did not prevent the owners from challenging what was given to them. In the violent accumulated 19th century modernism, the land owned and lived on by Black families was taken away from them through the use of eminent domain. And this is one of the first issues or times where you see eminent domain being used for the creation of a park. This reflects a brutal act of displacement against which the inhabitants had limited resources to fight. Home and landowners received some form of compensation. But this might not have meant with owner satisfaction, as can be seen in Andrew Williams's affidavit. In this affidavit, Williams protests the compensation of $2,335. Williams claimed that someone had previously offered him over $1,000 more to buy it. Here, there's some more information of Andrew Williams. And remember, we mentioned Andrew Williams when he first opened up as one of the initial purchasers of the property. And here you see it's listed in the census form 1855 with the value of his property. And he's listed with his wife and his family. And if you notice in that census, the people who are Black are listed with a B, but the others who are presumed white are not. You can also get a sense of what occupations are open to a person's based on the ethnicity and race. In addition, what I'm showing right now, I'm using different primary source documents to get you a sense of the makeup and the composition of the community. This is an example of a church record, is the All Angels Church. Unfortunately, although there are free churches, the records for two of the churches were destroyed. The free churches, two of them were African-American, one was a mixed congregation. The All Angels was a mixed congregation, and this is one where we have the most records. Here it's transcribed so you see it better. You get an idea of marriages, baptisms, burials. You also get a sense of the relationship between different members of the community. For example, you see who might have been a godparent for one, and you can interrelate that between the map record and the census record and get a sense of the bonds and links within the community. This example of a tax record. So in a way, there's an image painted as the inhabitants being squatters, slaves, but here you see ownership, you see taxes being paid. So you get a complete, a different picture. Even clearer is looking at the maps. You see the layout of the community. When you think of squatters, you don't think of something laid off within the Manhattan grid, and that's something we'll see a little bit later as we go along. Here, this is the Central Park condemnation map, and it shows you block 783 to 785. As you know, New York City is in the grid pattern with lots, with block and lots. And also, although the streets had not been developed going all the way to where Seneca Village was located, you can see the property owners built and developed their property within what was to be the block and lot. So the Seneca Village community, for the most part, was laid out within the New York grid of block and lots. The orderly layout contrasted the portrayal of the community in the smear campaign. From 82nd to 89th Streets and between 7th and 8th Avenue, encompassing blocks 783 to 789 on the Central Park condemnation map, The structures conform for the most part to layout of the streets and avenues laid out in the Commissioner's 1811 Manhattan Grid Plan, although the roads were not built. The recent rediscovery of survey markers provides some evidence that Seneca Village's residents anticipated the construction of the grid in the area at a future point. As such, the property owners built their structures within the block and lots of the NYC grid. I'll do a brief description of some of the blocks. So block 784, if you look close, you can see there are about 25 structures. Some are described as shanties at the value of $500. Two are described as houses and also valued at $500. Shanty is, the description of something as a shanty can be questioned sometimes, depending upon who is making that assessment, and look at the value given for what might have been given as a shanty versus what is not described as shanty being the same. There's one free-story structure over 1,400 square feet belonging to Sylvan Jameson, listed at a value of over $2,000. And there are several structures listed with no value. There are several areas that indicate as farmland. There's also a structure indicated and labeled as a shop owned by Ismail Allen. If you look at block 785, this block bonded between streets 84th Street and 8th Street and 7th and 8th Avenue. You can see most of the structures in this block are generally facing 84th Street on the southern end, and 7th Avenue on the eastern end, and 8th Street on the northern end. The All Angels Church sits at an angle between lots 53 and 56. Should make my cursor. That's the All Angels Church. And this one, we have this area we did some archaeology. That's the Wilson's property. The area which is formerly occupied by the Wilson family was excavated by the Institute for the Exploration of Seneca Village History during the summer of 2011. This is a closer direction for the All Angels Church and the Wilson's property. Now, if we were to turn to this article, we get a very different image of what the settlement was like. So within a period of 15 years, you see the story and the history of the area is almost silenced. That here you had a settlement of over 206 people, and within 15 years, an article comes out and there's no mention that there was a settlement inexistent, and the settlement of African Americans who lived in that area is totally wiped out. There's no idea of these burials stemming from cemeteries that are associated with the churches in the area. We question what was life for African Americans in New York City during that period. So, although New York City or New York State emancipated slaves in 1827, folks coming from states where slavery still existed could still bring in people who were enslaved to New York City until 1841. This is an image of blackbirders, and among the most, it's an image from 1839. And here you can see blackbirders. Blackbirders in New York City were men who would capture free African Americans and move them to areas where there was slavery. So, although New York City was a free state and had a high number of African Americans, nevertheless they faced racial hostility. In his autobiography, Frederick Douglass describes how he felt unsafe in New York City, which was a metropolis in a free state. One might assume that the climate of the city for free African Americans would be hospitable, and that someone is given a statement would find the environment here safe, because New York was another free state. However, Douglas describes something very different. In his autobiography, he states, "I saw in every white man an enemy, as in almost every colored man a cause to distrust. I was a most painful situation, and to understand it, one must need experience it." Or imagine himself in similar circumstances. Let him be a fugitive slave in a strange land, a land given up to be the hunting ground for slaveholders whose inhabitants are legalized kidnappers, where he is very moment subject to the terrible liability of being seized upon by his fellow men, as a hideous crocodile seizes upon his prey. So this image actually reinforces the image that Douglas paints. As we know, Seneca Village was also made up of Irish immigrants, and most of the Irish came towards the 1840s, when, in response to the Irish famine, they moved to New York as immigrants, and because of the racial climate at the time, they faced hostility because they were seen as others, and the other Irish follows the script of the process of colonization, with the English colonizing Ireland and creating an otherness of the Irish because they spoke a different language, they were a different religion. Most of the Irish at the time were Irish Catholic and spoke Gaelic. So, you know, a way to exploit them and dehumanize them, they were othered. And there's several stories that explore that issue. So, example, Noble Ignaty, one of his books looks at how the Irish become white, and exploring the idea of racial formation of Irish who initially come into the city and being othered, but being assumed and assuming whiteness as time goes on. So the process continues, and we have the idea the park is being built, it's going to get built, and there are different processes in the creation of the park. There are areas that are excavated, and where you find excavation, it would destroy the park, the features of the community. However, in addition to excavation, there are also areas that got filled, and areas that got filled would preserve what would be left of the community. And this actually mirrors the African burial ground, Lower Manhattan, where, because the hill next to that burial ground was leveled and that field placed over the African burial ground, successive development in Lower Manhattan did not destroy their burial ground. And it's good to reference burial ground in the history and its relationship with Seneca Village, in that when we think of the African-American presence in New York, it goes way back to the first settlement with the Dutch being in New York and Manhattan. We think of slavery and enslavement as a southern thing, but it has a relationship. It has a relationship in New York City and New York State. That presence is strong in that, apart from Seneca Village, we have other communities such as Wiggsville in Brooklyn, Sandy Ground in Staten Island, there's Skunk Hollow in Northern New Jersey. In addition, the Hudson Valley was a major area where agriculture was used to provide food for the city, and the labor force came from people who were enslaved, similar to what was happening in Long Island. And there are actually archaeological projects going on in these places that are exploring these issues also. So that history was lost for a number of years, and that history came back with the publication of A Park and People. by Roy Rosenberg and Elizabeth Blackmore. And in that, there's a chapter on Seneca Village, which showed the complexity, some complexity to that settlement. This was actually used for the exhibit entitled Before Central Park, The Life and Death of Seneca Village, which was curated by Cynthia Copeland, one of the directors of the Seneca Village project, and Grady Turner. Here you can see the exhibit using material to give a sense of what limited knowledge was known about the community during that period. Focus of part of the exhibit was the smear campaign, which denigrated the inhabitants. So I'll go quickly over some of the process we used to give you a sense of the process of historical archaeology in giving a sense of how we went about identifying areas to dig and learning about the community. So these are just an overlay of an aerial view of the area, followed by the historic map placed over it, and then the image structures from the historic map being digitized. So when we went in the field, we could get a sense of where features and structures were located. Before we actually did, we did soil tests. So this is Susanna Selby doing a shovel test, and she is a geoarchaeologist, and her specialty, for what she did, we could determine what areas were historical and what areas might have been brought in by fill. So one can just go through Central Park and start doing that sort of work. You need permission. Luckily, as you can see here, we had permission. So when the park police came, we had documentation to show that we had the right to do the work that we're doing there right now. Here's the process. This is what we call ground penetrating radar, and what he's doing here is sending a signal below the ground surface, and we look for anomalies in that. Depend upon the time that the signal comes back, you get a sense whether there's something different in that area. So, through the involvement of the advisory board and the community, we were able to get permission to do the dig. And the excavation was to ground truth results we got from the ground penetrating radar, and to get samples of material culture left by the people who lived in Seneca Village. We're limited to having the field be 8 weeks, and we could excavate no more than 25 units, which had to be 1 meter squares. And we're not allowed to leave the units open over the weekend, and we had to have a guard on site overnight. In addition, we're not allowed to cut roots from trees which were over ½ an inch in diameter. And this just shows you the areas that we did the test. Now, one area we thought that they might have been featured that was historical. It was historical, but this was actually a feature that was built during the time that the park was built. So it's actually a drainage wall. And here, the folks on the park were actually very excited to find that it was covered for a long period. Just run quickly. So the process of doing field work, we have to map the area that we do the work so that you can lay it off and put it within context. Here, these are students from the field school from 2011, excavating one of the 1 meter squares. When you dig, you have to screen the material is screened so the artifact stays above and the soil falls below. The archaeology is destructive, and it's important that the context of items, of artifacts, are taken into consideration. So here, drawings are made, measurements are taken. So depending upon the stratigraphy and layer that is found, we're able to date and see what period it comes from. This is just the students backfilling. This is the process of students in the lab cleaning, cataloging, and mending artifacts. So here you can see this is actually the stone wall from the foundation from the Wilson's home. And this structure, it was actually supported a 3-story structure, and the head of the household of Wilson's family was a sexton for the All Angels Church. This is a baking pan actually found on site, and it's just been x-rayed. Some of the artifacts again, this is a shoe, and because the size believe it was for infant, a young child. This is just a sampling of some of the artifacts, so glass shards, bone toothbrush, ceramic. And this is a layout of a Wilson structure. And that's from the image from some of the students and the directors from the 2011 field school. So in front you have Nan Rothschild from Columbia, Barnard, Diana Wall, formerly of City College, and Cynthia Copeland from NYU, and that's me and the cherry picker taking the image down there. This is just an image from the open house we held so that we can inform the community of the findings from the summer. And this is an exhibit from what we found from the artifacts that we held an exhibit at City College in the Cohen Library. And the exhibit tried to show the process that we archaeologists go through, the process of doing documentary research, non-invasive archaeology through exploration such as ground penetrating radar, and then actual excavation and the process of cataloging, cleaning, and mending artifacts. But one of the important things with the process of doing archaeology is bringing the process to the community so that they understand the process that archaeologists go through, and they get more engaged with the process of archaeology. Historical archaeology is critical in that it's able to give a voice to communities that have been silenced, in that most communities of people who might be minorities, or the optic and the vision and portrayal of these communities has been very negative. To a great extent, they have been silenced. By using historical archaeology, it gives them a voice by allowing the material culture to tell the story and the complexities of their lives. This is me working with high school students who visited the exhibit. This is an image for some of the advisory board members actually meeting one of the descendants after over 20 years of trying to get a descendant from the community. We actually made a contact with Ariel Williams, who is a descendant of Andrew Williams, one of the first property owners in Seneca Village. Here we have Diana Wall, myself, Meredith, Nan Rothschild, Cynthia, Sharon, Paul, and that's Ariel and Carl Jones. And now, and since we're almost running out of time, so that we have time for a question and answer.
Wonderful, thank you. So the questions have already been kind of rolling in as you've been talking. So I will just dive right in. Let's see, there we go, to the questions. Okay, so the first question is, and this one has 3 votes, so this was the popular one. If you had the ease of initiating another dig, what location at Seneca Village would be the site of the next excavation? And what would you seek to learn, or what question would you want to try and answer from this dig?
So what areas we'll try to maybe focus on would be the AME Zion Church, the one mentioned in the newspaper article. Since the relationship with the school would be important, you'll see the idea of a college, or school for college students. You get a sense of education being segregated in a period, and the importance of education in the community for the advancement of African Americans, and the idea towards striving to make it towards middle class through being educated. So, in addition, since it was the basement, the idea possibly did it serve as a stop point in the Underground Railroad? This possibility because of the political nature of the community and the idea that they wanted to be enfranchised, and the community being away from the prying eyes of Lower Manhattan. Did it serve as a point in that route? So that was something that would be of interest.
Great, thank you. So let's see, another question is, was Seneca Village inhabited by Blacks and Irish because Irish were considered quote unquote Black at the time?
That's a possibility because as noted in one of the newspaper articles, the process of ordering Irish as different, you can say, stems from the whole process of the colonization of Ireland, and that process continuing to the US. Because the Irish come into the US being mainly peasant farmers in that period, 1840s. They were different, they were more rural, so they were seen as different. They were Catholic. The idea of religion, although they're Christian, because being Catholic, that othered them also. The language was different. The idea, one of the board members, Meredith Flynn, actually explores the idea of looking at process of ethnicity with Irish and finding medicine bottles and looking at hair dyes. A significant number of Irish coming here, their hair texture would be red. So using hair dye so that they could pass as different. So dyeing their hair is a process of trying to assimilate in a way and make them more acceptable to the Anglo-Americans. So this is the process of racial formation. It's not something that happens overnight. It's a process, and it's a very complex process through different men. So you have that happening, and Irish living on the periphery to some extent of the community, but integrated in a sense. And with the construction of Central Park, vying that they would not work with African Americans in the construction of the park. So you have issues of conflict, but you also have African Americans and Irish living together in the 5 points. So it's not a one brush paints the whole community. There are several things happening, and you have to look at it very carefully, depending upon the period and the location that you're working with. Because you also have issues of race riots and who get targeted.
Okay. The next question is, was the time capsule ever recovered?
No. It's possible that it could have been destroyed with construction of the park, but we have no ideas yet.
Okay. All right, the next question has a couple of different votes, so a couple people want to know the answer to this one. Someone wrote, I wonder if there could be people buried in Central Park now from Seneca Village.
We are aware that there are burials. Why? Seneca Village had 3 churches, the African Union, the AME Zion, and All Angels. And there was a burial ground associated with each church. So the newspaper article talked in the discovery of 2 burials and saying that the areas they dug and no burials were there before can be misleading in that since your cemetery is associated with community, there will be burials there. And we know there are still burials, but out of respect for the descendant community, we did not do work where the burials are located. Because there's no need to do that right now. We know from the experience of the African burial ground, that's not something that there's a sensitivity to unearthing burials. If they are threatened, there's a different issue. If it's not threatened, we don't see the need to work in that area. And that's out of respect for the descendant community.
Yeah, that makes sense. The next question is, it says, I know that there has been work to increase signage about Seneca Village in the park. Are there plans for future exhibits or public-facing digital projects?
Yes. So the Central Park Conservancy actually worked together with the Institute for the Exploration of Seneca Village History and Community Board 10 to have signage that commemorates Seneca Village. But we want to go beyond that and to make something that's more meaningful, and technology exists right now that there are different forms where we can make it educational, in that this possibility exists where we can create something that might be virtual. We are walking through the area. One can use a QR code and get information of where structures or where different features might be located. So that's something that we'll be working on going forward, in creating a commemoration that's more significant, so that something that was significant to New York City's history is known beyond just a signage that's limited. But that's working with the community, working with Central Park Conservancy and the advisory board to see what works best for everybody. And it's a challenge, but it's worth the challenge. It's worth the fight.
All right. Someone else wants to know, do you think that there will ever be another chance to excavate Seneca Village?
Hopefully, yes. But not right now, because we've done one phase. Technology changes and the tools we use. This project has been going on for 20 years. So the technology we use initially, what we started with and what we did, what's available right now is very different. So it's good to do it in phases so that your tools of analysis improve, so that you don't destroy something. So when you have technology that's better, you have more to work with. So ideally, we can continue working with the documentary sources we have and the artifacts we have, but as we go on to see how we can further explore the site, but also use it as a tool for teaching students who normally would not be exposed to that sort of work, so that they can be sensitized to what role they can play as members of a descendant community in giving voice to their ancestors, to giving a direction as to what research questions should be asked going forward when we do that sort of research.
Right. Thank you.
We think that that's critical.
Someone else would like to know, was one of the churches moved? Oh, sorry. Hold on. My questions are moving as people vote. Let me come back. Oh, let me see if I can find that one. Okay, I'm going to start with this one then. Was Seneca Village isolated from other neighborhoods and communities in New York City? Was it the only inhabited / developed area in the area of the city that is now Central Park?
No, Seneca Village was one of several different communities. So overall in the area became Central Park, it's estimated that there are about 1,600 folks living in that entire area. But Seneca Village was in its own area, and its layout was very different from the other settlements. And it was significant in that most of the landowners and property owners were African American. And that's critical in that period, because not many people were willing to sell to African American families. So finding somebody, because of the process of just living in a racist society, the restriction to give them access to property limited where they could buy property. So by getting access to acquire property in that area, that gave them legitimacy to be enfranchised and vote, because of the change in requirements that African Americans male had to own property value at $250 and be resident of the city for 3 years in order to vote.
A couple of people would like to know what the origin is of the name Seneca Village.
That's a question that we have been searching for without an answer. So there's several different proposals, but as to the name, there's nothing definite right now.
Interesting. Okay, so I just made it to this other question that I was starting to ask you earlier. Was one of the churches moved, and do any remnants or the parish community, or maybe that means of the parish community, survive?
Yes, so as I mentioned, we were 3 churches, and we had members from the churches on the advisory board. So unfortunately, one of our longest serving advisory board members passed, and he was a member of the AME Zion Church, but he's been replaced. But there's also Paul Johnson from the All Angels Church, which moved from Seneca Village to Western Avenue. I have actually images of the structure moved from Seneca Village to Western Avenue, and the church expanding and growing around the original structure. And with New York City, as time goes on and the city expands and moves northwards, that structure getting knocked down and an apartment building being built and incorporated in the church on the first floor and the basement. So that's the All Angels Church, and it's on West End and 86th Street. And they're still part of the advisory board. And that's one of the churches where we have most of the records, because unfortunately, the other 2 churches, the records got destroyed for fires or through different forms of destruction.
Fascinating. Let's see. Someone else said, in terms of internments in Seneca Village, it is my understanding that they were moved, many to Cypress Hill Cemetery in Queens. I don't know if all were moved. Is this correct?
Yes, they're still, from the GPR, we recognize that they're still grave shafts. And as you can see from that article from 1871, just 14 inches beneath the ground surface that they found 2 burials. You get a sense of the possibility for more burials.
Okay. Okay. Two more questions or so. Were the residents of Seneca Village formerly enslaved people from New York or elsewhere?
So that information you get from census records, and what we can say that the folks living in Seneca Village, what we can say, they were free African Americans. It's possible that at some point, some of them might have been enslaved, but from what we can see, most of them, people in Seneca Village, were free African Americans. Seneca Village, because of the time it was settled in 1825, is just a period when New York State emancipates its slave in 1827. So there's a back and forth between the date of 1827 and 1841 when it actually takes place. But then by that period, you can see a shift in the relationship between people who are enslaved and slaveholders, and they moved from indentured labor to paid wages and the use of the exploitation of immigrants to fill that void in the shift of production. So the whole process of the capitalist structure exploiting the worker, you can see that in the shift taking place in New York City as it expands and grows with the immigrant population coming in. And we're looking at populations that have been displaced in different ways. So the Irish getting displaced in Ireland and coming to New York. But African Americans, the ancestors originally been displaced in Africa and captured and exploited and used here. So there you have populations displaced and moved, and there's a vying for geographic space and means of production. And a lot of it is not clean, it's violent, it's ugly, but it needs exploration, it needs analysis. It's uncomfortable, but we don't know the past, and we can't solve our problems if we don't explore it and iron out the ugliness.
Okay, and someone says, where can I learn more about Seneca Village?
There's several sources. We are revamping the website for Seneca Village, but I have a list. Let me see, I can get my 1 minute. This is just some additional resources for African American sites and archaeology in the New York City area, including Seneca Village. There you go. So that I
just made that screen a little bigger so people can see that. Wonderful.
And this is some selected bib also.
Great. Oh, I see a lot of people writing to you from City College in the chat saying hello.
And it's good to highlight the importance. City College plays a prominent role in that whole endeavor. So, and the idea that this is a collaborative. So I'm giving information, but it's teamwork. I'm one person. I'm part of a team. So Diana Wall, Dan Rothschild, C.P. Copeland, Mary Difflin, and the many college students and high school students that we work with, they all played a role in doing documentary sources, sourcing it, learning how to transcribe and work with material, being in the field. Also, the various specialists we worked with. So everybody has played a crucial role in getting that information that I'm able to pass on to you right now.
Wonderful. Well, thank you again, Herbert. It's really fascinating to learn more about Seneca Village, which I think more people need to know about, but also to listen about the ongoing research that's being conducted is fascinating. So thank you again so much for being with us tonight. I hope everyone enjoyed this talk, and we hope that people will consider making a donation to help enable us to continue to offer free public programs. Gifts in any amount are very much appreciated. I'd also like to remind you that this was the first in our series of 6 lectures in our Talking About Race Matters series. So we hope that you will join us here every Wednesday at 6 p.m. here on Crowdcast. Be sure to register through the links provided on our social media. And we will see you next week, which is Wednesday, February 10th at 6 p.m. for the story of Dyckman Oval, Uptown Manhattan's historic Negro League baseball stadium, with Don Rice, who is our board president and a local historian. Thank you so much for joining us, and have a great evening. We'll see you next week.